The sound comes first, a hollow creak of wood straining under weight, a slow grinding of stone on flesh. Then comes the breath, ragged and shallow, forcing its way through the silence. Somewhere in the darkness, ribs crack like snapping twigs, and a prayer, barely more than a whisper, slips out between broken gasps. For 3 days, she remained alive and conscious beneath 700 pounds of stone, not bound, not bleeding, but crushed, inch by inch, until the shape of her body vanished beneath the weight of her sentence. Every breath she took was an act of defiance. Every heartbeat a rebellion against the machinery of power that demanded her silence. The chamber is small, cold, lit by the dull flicker of torches that make the air seem thick, suffocating. Around her, men stand in uneasy formation, soldiers, judges, a physician with trembling hands. They wait for the moment her will gives out. It never does. Outside, the city goes on as if nothing is happening. Bells ring in the distance, markets open, the river flows beneath the bridge where the world is ending for one woman. But beneath that calm surface, something shifts. The air itself seems to carry her suffering, a story too terrible to be forgotten. This was not a legend, not a myth spun from superstition or rumor. It happened here, in York, England, in the year 1586. A real woman, condemned not for violence but for faith. A punishment designed not only to kill her, but to make her death a spectacle, slow, deliberate, and unforgettable. How does a human being stay awake through 72 hours of agony? How does she keep praying while her bones collapse under stone? How does she forgive those who press the life out of her with measured cruelty? Her name would echo through centuries, whispered in secret by those who saw in her torment something divine, or something monstrous. What happened on that bridge would haunt England's conscience and change forever the meaning of justice, pain, and faith. Before we uncover this forgotten horror, take a second to subscribe to Echoes of Time, where the past still speaks. England, 1586. The air itself was thick with suspicion. The kingdom stood on a knife's edge, trembling between devotion and treason, faith and fear. The Reformation had torn the soul of England in two, and in its wake came paranoia, an invisible plague spreading through every parish, every market, every household. In London, the crown sat uneasy upon Queen Elizabeth's head. Across the sea, the armies of Catholic Spain gathered like thunderclouds. Within England's own walls, whispers of conspiracy twisted through taverns and churches alike. Priests were hunted like wolves, their presence a crime punishable by death. Families who sheltered them vanished behind the gray walls of prisons, or worse, beneath the executioner's blade. It was an age where confession could be a weapon, and prayer could condemn you. Children were taught to watch their parents, neighbors to spy on neighbors. The very air was charged with dread, the sense that salvation itself had become an act of rebellion. In this world, where silence was safer than truth, one woman chose otherwise. Her house was small, her means modest, but behind her closed doors burned a dangerous devotion. In hidden rooms, candlelight flickered over forbidden altars. The Latin words of an outlawed mass echoed against the walls, whispered by trembling lips that still believed salvation lay beyond the reach of royal decree. She offered sanctuary to those who no longer had a place to pray, men who came by night, cloaked and pale from months in hiding. She gave them bread, shelter, and faith. What she did was considered treason, not because it threatened the crown's power, but because it defied its authority over the human soul. To the world, she was an ordinary wife and mother, but to those who still clung to the old faith, she was a lifeline. And to the state, she was a symbol that had to be broken publicly, painfully, completely. The shadow of the crown stretched long over England. Every church that dared whisper the Latin creed risked being torn apart. Every home that opened its doors to a fugitive priest became a battlefield between conscience and survival. The Queen's men were everywhere, informers paid in silver and secrecy. They watched, they listened, they waited. until the day came when the whisper of devotion inside one home in York reached their ears. The house was marked. The silence around it became a noose. And when the knock came, hard, cold, final, it carried not only the weight of law, but of centuries of hatred disguised as justice. What would you have done in her place? Let me know where you're watching from. I read every comment. Her name was Margaret Clitherow, a wife, a mother, a midwife, a woman whose quiet devotion would one day shake the conscience of a nation. She had not plotted treason, nor raised a weapon against the crown. Her only crime was faith, the wrong faith, at the wrong time, in the wrong kingdom. When the soldiers forced open the door of her home, they found little more than what any mother might keep: bread, candles, a few worn books. But among them lay the evidence that sealed her fate: holy vestments, a chalice, and the whisper of prayers not meant to be heard in Protestant England. Margaret was taken in irons to York Castle. The chill of the cell met her like the hand of death itself. Stone walls weeping with moisture, the air so heavy it stifled breath. Outside, the city moved on. Within, the machinery of justice prepared its lesson for all who might defy the crown. Days later, she stood before the judges, her wrists bound, but her gaze unshaken. The charges were read: harboring priests, hearing mass, and reconciling others to the old faith. Each one carried the weight of death. The judges expected confession, contrition, surrender. They were met with silence. Under English law, an accused must plead, guilty or not guilty. Only then could a trial proceed. But Margaret refused. She did not speak a word. Her silence filled the hall like thunder. The judges demanded an answer. Still she said nothing. They threatened her with the consequences of defiance, but she did not yield. To modern ears, her silence might sound like madness, yet within that stillness was reason, calculated, deliberate, unbreakable. If she had pleaded, she would surely be condemned, and all she owned would be seized by the crown. Her husband left penniless, her children cast into the streets. But if she refused to speak, if she never entered a plea, then by law she could not be tried. Her property would remain intact. Her silence would protect her family. There was more. In a trial, her husband and children could be forced to testify, their words used to destroy her. She would not allow that. She would die before she let their voices condemn her. And so she stood before the court, lips pressed together, a mother choosing to bear the full weight of the crown's wrath so her children would never have to. The judges, their patience drained, pronounced her sentence. The words struck the air like a hammer. Then you will be pressed to death, until you speak, or until you die. Few in that chamber understood what that meant. Fewer still had seen it done. It was a punishment older than the kingdom itself. Pain forte dure, the strong and hard pain. A board laid upon the body, stone upon stone, until the lungs collapsed and the ribs splintered inward. It was meant to force a confession. It was meant to crush not only flesh but will. Margaret bowed her head once. She neither protested nor begged for mercy. Her silence was her final act of defiance, her last sermon in a world where faith had become treason. The judges recorded her refusal. The guards led her away. Outside the hall, the murmurs of the crowd rippled like a living thing. Fear, pity, disbelief. Some said she was mad. Others whispered she was holy. None would forget her. That night, in the cold darkness of her cell, Margaret prayed, not for rescue, but for endurance. She knew what awaited her: the weight, the darkness, the slow suffocation beneath the law's unflinching hand. And still, she chose silence. It was not pride that guided her, but love. The kind of love that would rather be crushed into the earth than see a child bear guilt. This was not merely a trial. It was the birth of a martyrdom, a moment when law and conscience collided, and one woman refused to yield. If stories like this make you reflect on how far justice has come, or how far it has yet to go, remember to like this video. It helps echoes of time reach more curious minds. Dawn broke cold over York on the 25th of March. The mist hung low over the river, thick as breath on glass. Beneath that pale light, a wooden platform waited, rough-hewn and slick with dew. Beside it stood a heavy door torn from some merchant's house, its hinges still dangling, its purpose now corrupted. Around it lay the stones, flat, uneven, marked by the hands that had carried them there through the night. They were arranged in careful order, from the smallest to the heaviest, each one chosen to play its part in a ritual of controlled destruction. At the edge of the platform, a man in a dark coat prepared his instruments. He was no executioner, but a physician, summoned not to heal, but to watch. His duty was to measure how long a body could remain alive beneath the crushing weight of justice. He carried a pouch of tinctures and powders, his hands steady, his eyes cold. He would take her pulse, note the color of her lips, and when her mind began to slip into the mercy of unconsciousness, he would find ways to bring her back. Science, in service of cruelty. The crowd gathered as the bell struck 8. Merchants, soldiers, children lifted onto shoulders. Some came out of duty, others out of curiosity. No one truly understood what they were about to witness. The soldiers led her forward, Margaret, barefoot, pale, wrapped in a linen shift. She moved slowly but without fear, her eyes steady as she looked upon the instruments prepared for her. There was no gallows, no rope, only the door and the stones. They laid her down upon the ground. The board was placed upon her chest, covering her from shoulder to thigh. Her arms were stretched wide, her hands bound with coarse rope. The cold from the stone seeped into her skin. She began to pray. The words were faint, Latin syllables carried away by the wind, yet each one fell like a spark in the heavy silence. The first stones were placed, light ones, almost gentle. Her breath caught. She murmured another prayer. The physician watched, his fingers at her wrist. When he nodded, more stones followed. The wood creaked. The crowd shifted uneasily. For the first hours, she did not cry out. Her voice rose only in prayer, steady, rhythmic, a heartbeat of faith beneath the weight. By midday, her breathing had turned shallow. The physician knelt, pressed his ear close, and nodded again. More stones, more pressure. The ribs bent inward with the sound of green branches breaking. Still, she did not scream. Night fell, and torches flickered along the bridge. The crowd thinned, but the soldiers remained, ordered to keep her alive, to continue until she spoke. Through the hours of darkness, she whispered fragments of the rosary, her voice trembling between breaths. When her strength faltered, the physician forced a few drops of water between her lips, not out of mercy but necessity. The law demanded her consciousness. Day turned again. Her face had swollen, her skin darkened where the stones pressed deepest. Each inhalation came with a wet, rattling sound, but her eyes were open. Witnesses said she looked not at the men above her but past them, as though she saw something beyond the smoke and mist. The second day stretched into torment beyond imagination. Her ribs had fractured completely, the board sinking closer to the ground. When the weight grew unbearable, she began to hum, low, broken notes of a hymn once sung in secret masses. The crowd that had come to mock her now stood silent. Some wept openly. Others crossed themselves, defying the very law that condemned her. Even the soldiers lowered their heads. As the second night bled into morning, Margaret's breath came in gasps. The physician, pale now, whispered that she could not last. Yet the order stood. She must remain alive until she spoke. More stones were brought, heavy ones that took 2 men to lift. The door groaned as they were placed. Her body shuddered once, then stilled. The physician leaned in, a pulse, faint, but still there. He signaled for them to wait. Hours passed. The mist thickened. Then, as the sun broke through the clouds, she moved her lips. Those nearest leaned close, expecting surrender, confession, anything. But what they heard was not pleading. It was forgiveness. She spoke the names of the men who had carried out the sentence one by one, and said she forgave them. Some turned away, their faces wet, The physician covered his eyes. Her final words were the same spoken centuries before on another cross. "Into thy hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit." Her chest rose once more, held the breath as if the body itself refused to let go, and then it fell. The platform was still. She had endured 72 hours beneath the stones, never screaming, never begging, never recanting her faith. The silence that had condemned her became the silence that made her immortal. If you're still here with me, you're part of a rare few who face history's darkest truths. Hit subscribe. Echoes of Time has more stories the world tried to bury. When the final breath left her body, York fell silent. The torches that had burned through 3 nights sputtered in the wind, as though even the flames could not bear witness any longer. Soldiers stood motionless, staring down at what they had done. The wooden door sagging under its load, the stones slick with morning dew. Beneath it lay what was left of Margaret Clitherow, the woman who had refused to speak. Her body was crushed beyond recognition, but her face, witnesses said, looked strangely at peace. The physician knelt beside her, pressed 2 fingers to her neck, and whispered that it was over. Yet the silence that followed was not one of relief. It was shame. Even those who had carried out the Queen's law could not meet each other's eyes. They had watched a woman die without a scream, without a curse, without surrender. They had seen endurance that defied the purpose of pain itself. Word spread through York before the stones were lifted. By noon, the city was alive with whispers. Mothers drew their children close, and even men hardened by war spoke her name in hushed tones. When the soldiers moved to carry the body away, the crowd surged forward. People reached for her, for a scrap of her garment, a lock of her hair, anything that had touched her during those hours of torment. They tore the linen into pieces and hid them in their clothing, not out of morbid fascination, but because they believed they had witnessed something holy. The authorities panicked. They ordered the body buried quickly in secret without a marker. No procession, no prayers, no final rites. But the attempt to bury her memory failed before the soil closed over her. In taverns, in market squares, and in whispered prayers at night, the story of the woman pressed to death began to take root. The punishment meant to terrify England into silence had instead lit a fire that could not be put out. In the weeks that followed, reports reached London that the people of York spoke of her as a martyr. The Queen's Council called for denials, pamphlets, and proclamations. They said her death had been swift, her silence a stubborn choice, her pain exaggerated. But truth has a way of surviving the weight of lies. Too many had seen the slow hours, had counted the days, had heard the last prayer on her lips. The legend of Margaret Clitherow had already slipped beyond the control of kings. Years passed, then centuries. The law that had crushed her body began to crumble. Judges and lawmakers who studied her case saw in it the limits of power, the moment when justice had turned into cruelty. Slowly, pressing as punishment faded from England's courts, until in 1772 it was abolished altogether. In the record of Parliament's debate, her name is not written, but every voice that spoke for reform echoed her silence. Her endurance became more than memory. It became principle. The notion that no government should wield the power to torture under the guise of law, that punishment must end before it becomes inhuman. These ideas were born from the horror of her death. When nations later wrote of rights, when laws forbade cruel and unusual punishment, the ghost of Margaret Clitherow was there, standing behind the words. Centuries after the stones fell, the church canonized her. A woman who had lived quietly in a butcher's house in York was now St. Margaret, the Pearl of York. Pilgrims walked the same bridge where she had lain, tracing the stones that once bore her weight. Her courage was carved into glass and marble, her prayers repeated by voices that would never know her face. But the meaning of her death reached beyond any altar. It belonged to all who had ever stood alone before the machinery of power, who had refused to betray conscience, even when the cost was flesh and bone. She proved that silence could be stronger than the voice of kings, that faith could endure longer than law. More than 400 years have passed since her ribs broke beneath the board, but her defiance still breathes through every discussion of justice, every courtroom that questions the limits of authority, every voice that speaks against cruelty, done in the name of order. The body that was crushed is dust, but the idea that rose from it still walks among us. If this story moved you, share it, and tell us in the comments which country you're watching from. The echoes of time travel farther when you do. She was crushed by the weight of her silence, yet her story still speaks. It murmurs through the centuries like the sound of stones shifting under earth, a quiet reminder of how far the human spirit can stretch before it breaks, and how even when the body yields, conviction can remain untouched. In her time, Margaret Clitherow was one among thousands caught between faith and the crown. But her choice, to stay silent when speech would have doomed her family, turns what could have been a forgotten execution into something greater. It is the moment when personal conscience stood still against the entire force of a kingdom. Each age believes itself beyond the cruelty of the last, and yet the lesson repeats. The forms change, the tools are new, but the same question endures. How much power should any state hold over the soul of an individual? Hers was a small defiance, a quiet resistance, yet it revealed the hollowness behind authority that demands obedience at the price of humanity. The bridge where she died is long rebuilt. The city around it thrives. But somewhere in its stones, the echo remains. When the wind passes over the river on a gray morning, it carries a trace of that breath, the one that refused to surrender, the last that whispered forgiveness. History remembers kings and empires for what they built, but it remembers people like Margaret for what they endured. The weight that once sought to erase her only pressed her story deeper into time. Thank you for exploring history's darkest corners with echoes of time. Subscribe to uncover the past that refuses to stay buried.